Imperialism is a scourge of the earth. It is something which has been around almost as long as humanity itself, and it's something which continues to wreak havoc on the world today. When we are taught history in school, we are often taught a trivialized, saturated version of history, which glosses over many of the crimes of these empires. And speaking particularly as a British person, I can say with full confidence that I was not taught the full detail of the British Empire while I was in school. I was not taught about many of the atrocities committed about the British Empire. I didn't get to study these things until I went to university and studied history. And only then did I realize, wow, the British Empire was not very nice. It did a lot of bad things to the world. And speaking as a Welsh person within Britain, even my country has been subjected to 1,000 years of British oppression, and I wasn't even aware of it. I would go on school trips to Conwy Castle or Carnarvon Castle, and we would all be taught about these castles and how amazing they are and how they're big structures and bricks. And here's the thing, they were made by Edward I, a man who sought to oppress the Welsh, and that's why these buildings exist. So yes, even as a British person, I too have been a victim of the British Empire. Crazy, right? So we're going to look at 10 of the worst crimes committed by the British Empire. Now, these are not in any particular order. They might end up in some kind of order in terms of bad and in terms of terrible, and but we're going to dive into 10 of the worst crimes committed by the British Empire so that we can further see just how bad this empire was. Now, I know it did a lot of good things too, and there are plenty of videos out there which talk about them. So if you want to find a video which is very happy and friendly towards the British Empire, you can find many out there, but this one is not that video. So if you are going to be offended by any of these accusations against the British Empire, then I would suggest this is not the video for you. But I would also suggest this is the video for you because you need to hear about what this empire did. So without further ado, here are 10 of the worst crimes committed by the British Empire. Number 10. Rhodesia's Unilateral Declaration of Independence, 1965. So Rhodesia's Unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI, in 1965 marked a significant chapter in the history of Southern Africa. For those who don't know, Rhodesia is modern-day Zimbabwe. The move, orchestrated by the white minority government led by Prime Minister Ian Smith, severed ties with the British Crown and set the stage for a protracted struggle for independence. So, just a little background. Rhodesia, located in Southern Africa, now Zimbabwe, was a British colony since the late 19th century. The British South Africa Company, led by Cecil Rhodes, played a crucial role in the region's colonization, and by the mid-20th century, tensions emerged between the white minority ruling class and the indigenous black population over issues such as land ownership and political representation. So as the winds of change swept through Africa, and they did during this time, pushing for decolonization, British government sought to address racial imbalances in its colony. However, the white minority government in Rhodesia, fearing loss of power and privileges, resisted these efforts. Negotiations between the British and Rhodesia reached an impasse over the issue of majority rule, leading to heightened tensions. And on the 11th of November 1965, Prime Minister Ian Smith and his government unilaterally declared independence from Britain. The UDI was a direct response to the failure of negotiations and a rejection of British efforts to impose a timetable for majority rule. Smith's government sought to maintain a white minority rule and resisted international pressure to accept majority rule. Britain then responded with Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister at the time, condemning Rhodesia's UDI as illegal and a breach of constitutional principles. The United Nations also denounced the move, imposing economic sanctions on Rhodesia to force it back into the fold. Britain engaged in diplomatic efforts to isolate Rhodesia, seeking support from the international community to undermine its economy and to pressure the white minority regime. So, with all that said, why is this one of the 10 worst things the British Empire did? Well, quite simply, it allowed it to happen. It didn't try hard enough to prevent Smith and his white minority government from taking over Rhodesia, and this created a lot of problems. So, this led to a protracted conflict in Rhodesia and marked a beginning of guerrilla warfare and international isolation for the country. The Bush War ensued, lasting until 1979, when negotiations at Lancaster House in London resulted in a settlement that paved the way for Zimbabwe's independence. And in 1980, Zimbabwe emerged as an independent nation with majority rule under the leadership of Robert Mugabe. We all know who Robert Mugabe is, and yes, this failure by Britain allowed a white minority leadership to take over, which then eventually led to Robert Mugabe, who is in some ways worse than the white minority leadership. So Britain didn't try hard enough to protect Zimbabwe and give it the proper independence it deserved, and this is why this is number 10 on this list. Number 9. Culture Cultural looting. It has become a meme in recent times to joke about how so many items from around the world, historical items, are all to be found in one place, the British Museum. And this is, without a doubt, one of the worst things the British Empire has done. The issue of cultural artifacts acquired through colonization, often described as looting, has been a subject of significant debate and controversy. British colonial history has no exception, with numerous instances of the acquisition of cultural and historical items from various regions under British rule. The retention of these items in museums and private collections has led to ongoing discussions about repatriation and the ethics of holding such cultural heritage. Such historical, worldly items as the Benin bronzes, which came into British possession during the late 19th century. Another example is the Elgin marbles, which are a collection of classical Greek marble sculptures that once adorned the Parthenon and other buildings on the Acropolis of Athens. And again, in the early 19th century, these came into the hands of the British Empire. Then we have the Magdala treasures, which in 1868 British forces ransacked the fortress of Emperor Tewadros II in Magdala, now known as Ethiopia. There is the Koh-i-Noor diamond, now a part of the British Crown Jewels, which has a complex history of ownership and has been the subject of much debate because it was originally mined in India. It is not British. So this has been a large, wide-scale problem, and it's one which comes under great scrutiny today as people are now calling for these artifacts to be returned to their rightful countries. We see it with the Rosetta Stone, for example, as a recent example of something in the British Museum which Egypt is now wanting to claim back. These items should be returned to their rightful countries, and this is a much discussed about topic today, and it's one of the 10 worst things the British Empire has done. Number 8, the Bengal Famine of 1943. So, the Bengal Famine of 1943 stands as one of the darkest chapters in India's colonial history, characterized by widespread starvation and a tragic loss of life. So, during World War II, Bengal, a province in then British India, faced a severe food shortage exacerbated by a combination of factors. The war disrupted normal trade routes, leading to reduced rice imports. Additionally, the Japanese occupation of Burma, which is now Myanmar, further hindered the flow of rice into Bengal. Poor governance, market manipulations, and the forced rice procurement policies of the British colonial administration further deepened the crisis. So what did Britain do to exacerbate and further create this problem? This absolute disgusting problem. So the British administration, under the leadership of Governor Richard Casey, implemented policies that prioritized rice procurement for the war effort. The government compelled Bengal's farmers to sell rice to support British troops and war allies, leaving the local population vulnerable to famine. The extraction of rice for the war effort significantly contributed to the scarcity of food. Then there was the hoarding and black market operations by traders seeking to profit from the crisis, worsened by the food shortage. The colonial administration failed to regulate these practices effectively and allowed unscrupulous traders to manipulate prices and exacerbate the famine conditions. Then, despite being aware of the escalating humanitarian crisis, the British administration's response was inadequate. Relief efforts were hindered by bureaucratic inefficiencies, lack of understanding of the scale of the problem, and a reluctance to divert resources from the war. The failure to take timely and effective action resulted in countless deaths from starvation and related disease. Then, lastly, there are accounts of racial bias and indifferences among some of the British officials who viewed the Bengali population with a lack of empathy. The perception of the Indian population as expendable in the context of the war effort further hindered the implementation of effective relief measures. So, as you can probably get from this, the British allowed this to happen. They failed to act on it because of an indifference, and with a racist view, they didn't care, and that's what caused the Bengali famine of 1943. And if I was to make this in an order of the 10 worst, this is probably my number 1. Anyway, number 7, we have the Mau Mau Uprising between 1952 and 1960. The Mau Mau Uprising, which unfolded in British-controlled Kenya between 1952 and 1960, was a pivotal moment in the struggle for African independence. So let's explore some of the causes, the dynamics, and Britain's role in the Mau Mau Uprising. So in the early 20th century, Kenya, then a British colony, experienced social and economic upheavals due to British settler colonization, land dispossession, and the exploitation of African labour. By the 1950s, discontent among the Kikuyu people, Kenya's largest ethnic group, culminated in the formation of the Mau Mau movement, a secret society that sought to resist British rule and address issues of land alienation and political marginalisation. So Britain's role in this was pretty bad. So the root cause of the Mau Mau Uprising can be traced back to the dispossession of Kikuyu lands by British settlers. settlers. The indigenous population was forced off fertile lands, leading to economic hardship and social unrest. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This seems to be a common theme with the British Empire. Anyway, the settlers' economic interests often clash with the needs of the local population, creating a volatile environment. The British colonial administration responded to growing dissent with repressive measures. The settlers and colonial authorities instituted policies that further marginalized the indigenous population. The introduction of the hut tax and restrictive land policies intensified grievances and fueled the Mau Mau movement. Then, in an attempt to quell the uprising, the British authorities implemented a policy of mass detention. Thousands of Kikuyu were interned in detention camps where reports of torture, abuse, and extrajudicial killing surfaced. There is footage out there of this too, so this is not something that has been made up to make the disaster or the crisis look worse than it was. This is definitely out there. The harsh treatment of detainees contributed to international condemnation and a re-evaluation of Britain's colonial practices. The British military played a significant role in suppressing the Mau Mau uprising. Operation Anvil, launched in 1954, aimed to dismantle the Mau Mau infrastructure. British forces engaged in a brutal counter-insurgency campaign employing tactics such as forced resettlement, collective punishment, and the declaration of a state of emergency. Then, the British colonial administration responded to the Mau Mau uprising not only through military force but also through legal and political measures. The Hola massacre in 1959, particularly where 11 Mau Mau detainees were killed, highlighted the brutality of the colonial regime. The outcry following this incident and increased international pressure led to a reassessment of British policies in Kenya and ultimately, finally, led to Kenya's independence from the British Empire. So, the Mau Mau uprising had profound consequences. While the Mau Mau did not achieve its immediate goals during the revolt, the movement played a pivotal role in shaping Kenya's path to independence. The repression of the Mau Mau, coupled with changing global attitudes towards colonialism, prompted the British to reconsider their imperial policies. Kenya finally gained independence in 1963, and the Mau Mau uprising remains a symbol of resistance against colonial oppression. So, as you can see here, the British were once again oppressing an African nation which was treated as second-class citizens and was, it's bad, people. It's very bad, and it's number 7 on this list. Number 6, the Partition of India. So the Partition of India in 1947 is a significant event in modern history that had profound and lasting consequences for the Indian subcontinent and indeed the larger world. The partition marked the end of British colonial rule in India and the creation of 2 independent nations, India and Pakistan. While the end of colonial rule was a momentous occasion, the partition itself was marked by violence, displacement, and communal tensions. Let's explore the Partition of India and discuss some of the mistakes made by Britain during this critical period. So, one of the major mistakes made by the British colonial rulers in India was the implementation of the divide and rule policy. The British administration exploited existing religious, linguistic, and cultural differences among the diverse communities in India in order to maintain control. This divisive policy sowed the seeds of communalism, making it easy for the British to control the population by exacerbating tensions between Hindus and Muslims. The decision to divide Britain into 2 separate nations, India and Pakistan, was a hasty and poorly planned process. The Radcliffe Line, which demarcated the boundaries between India and Pakistan, was drawn by Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never even been to India before. Like, what the heck, man? The rushed nature of the partition led to arbitrary border demarcations that did not consider the demographic, cultural, and economic realities of the region. The British authorities then failed to adequately consult with Indian leaders and communities during the partition planning. The decisions were often made in London, without considering the ground realities and aspirations of the people of India. India to London, it's a bit of a distance. This lack of consultation contributed to the widespread discontent and violence that followed the partition. The British administration did not take sufficient measures to ensure the security and safety of the people during the partition. The mass migration of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs across the newly drawn borders resulted in widespread communal violence, leading to the loss of countless lives and the displacement of millions. The British could have done more to prevent and mitigate the violence that erupted as a result of the partition, but they didn't, because as we've seen so far, the British are bad. They kind of suck. The partition created severe socio-economic challenges for both India and Pakistan. The sudden division of resources, industries, and administrative infrastructure led to economic hardships in both nations. The British could have played a more active role in addressing these issues and providing a smooth transition for the newly formed countries, but they didn't. Anyway, the British failure to address communal tensions and the divisive policies implemented during their rule left a lasting legacy of religious animosity between Hindus and Muslims. This continues to impact the region today as India and Pakistan grapple with ongoing tensions and conflicts as they sort of remain in a constant state of Cold War. So, the Partition of India was a complex and tumultuous process that resulted in widespread suffering and long-term consequences for the subcontinent, and it's all the fault of the British Empire. Number 6. The Boer War concentration camps. So when you hear the term concentration camp, you almost certainly think of the concentration camps implemented by the Nazi Party during the Second World War. You know, the concentration camps such as Auschwitz, which were extermination camps designed to destroy the Jewish people. Well, the British did it before then with the Boer War camps. Let's explore them. The Boer War concentration camps, which took place from 1899 to 1902 during the Second Boer War in South Africa, were a dark chapter in the history of conflict and colonialism. The war pitted British forces against the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers in the region, and the British response to the guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the Boers included the establishment of concentration camps. So, as the Boer War progressed, British forces faced difficulties in dealing with the Boer guerrilla warfare tactics. In an attempt to gain control and suppress the Boer resistance, the British established concentration camps to intern Boer civilians, including women and children. The intention was to separate Boer families from the guerrilla fighters and to deprive the insurgents of support. The conditions within the concentration camps were deplorable. Overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and poor medical facilities resulted in rampant disease and high mortality rates. The data for this is all available online. We're happy to link some for you. The camps became breeding grounds for illnesses such as typhoid and dysentery, leading to the tragic deaths of thousands of Boer civilians, especially children. Perhaps one of the most significant criticisms of the British handling of the concentration camps was the shockingly high mortality rates. Many Boer civilians, particularly children, succumbed to disease and malnutrition in these camps. The lack of proper medical care and the harsher living conditions were contributing factors, and the death toll became a source of international condemnation. The British authorities failed to provide sufficient supplies and rations to the inmates of the concentration camps. The Boer civilians faced food shortages, and the quality of the available provisions was often substandard. This contributed to malnutrition and weakened the resilience of the camp's inhabitants against disease. The establishment and management of the concentration camps drew criticism not only from within Britain but also from the international community. Humanitarians and individuals such as Emily Hobhouse, for example, exposed to harsh conditions in the camps, leading to public outcry and calls for reform. The Boer War concentration camps had a profound impact on the reputation of the British Empire, which, as we've explored so far, is not that great to begin with. And the harsh treatment of civilians and the high mortality rates tarnished Britain's image, and the episode remains a stain on its colonial history, which again, not great to begin with. The camps underscored the ethical and moral responsibilities that colonial powers bear when dealing with civilian populations during times of conflict. The legacy of the Boer War concentration camps persists in South African history and is still talked about today. The impact on Boer communities, the trauma endured by those who survived, and there are accounts from these people too, probably available on YouTube, I haven't checked, and the resentment generated by these events contributed to the long-lasting consequences for the relationships between different communities in South Africa. So, to conclude, the Boer War concentration camps represent a very dark chapter in the history of colonial conflict. And as we've explored so far, and as we're going to continue to explore in the next episode, this is a dark empire anyway. I mean, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, that's because God doesn't trust it with the light off, my friend. So, number 4, the British oppression of Ireland. Where do we even begin with the British oppression of Ireland? So let's try and go to the beginning, I guess. The history of British oppression in Ireland spans several centuries and is marked by a complex interplay of political, social, and economic factors. The relationship between Britain and Ireland has been fraught with tension, conflict, and resistance, and overcoming. It is crucial to understand the historical context to appreciate the depth of the grievances felt by the Irish people. So let's begin with the beginning. Early colonization and plantations between the 12th and 17th century. So the roots of British oppression in Ireland can be traced back to the Norman invasion of Ireland in the 12th century. Over time, British monarchs sought to exert control over Ireland, viewing it as a strategic and economic asset. The Tudor and Stuart monarchs particularly initiated a series of plantations where lands confiscated from Irish landowners were given to English and Scottish settlers. This led to dispossession, displacement, and economic marginalisation of the native Irish people. Then we go to the religious discrimination. So the imposition of Protestantism by the English crown further deepened divisions in Ireland, which of course is traditionally Catholic. The penal laws, enacted in the late 17th century, aimed at suppressing the Catholic majority by restricting their rights, education, and political participation. This religious discrimination exacerbated tensions and contributed to the marginalisation of the Catholic Irish population. Then there is the especially dark chapter of the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, roughly, and it's one of the darkest chapters in Irish history for a reason. The devastating potato blight, coupled with British policies and inadequate relief efforts, efforts led to the deaths of around 1 million people and the mass emigration of millions more. Oh, you thought the potato famine was just a potato famine and the causes were not British? Well, I'm afraid I got some bad news. The British government's response, characterized by a laissez-faire attitude and reliance on market forces, exacerbated the humanitarian crisis and intensified the perception of British indifference. Additionally, the Great Famine led to a lot of Irish people having to move from Ireland to the United Kingdom and various other places around the world, and the Irish diaspora, which I am part of, is everywhere. To this day, Ireland's population has not recovered from this. It is still lower now than it was then. Crazy to think about. It damaged greatly the Irish culture, the population, the language, which is only just recovering and barely. It's not been good. Then we have home rule and resistance of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and this witnessed a resurgence of Irish nationalism and demands for home rule, which aimed at securing self-governance for Ireland within the United Kingdom. The British government's resistance to home rule and the subsequent events such as the Easter Rising of 1916 and the War of Independence between 1919 and 1921 demonstrated a continuation of oppressive policies and marked the beginning of the end of British rule in Ireland. Though only just. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, which we did a short video on yesterday, led to the establishment of the Irish Free State, but also resulted in the partition of Ireland, which created Northern Ireland. And this division sowed the seeds for decades of sectarian conflict and discrimination against the nationalist Catholic community in Northern Ireland. Hey, where have we seen the United Kingdom halve a country and play their religious differences against each other? Where have we seen this? It sounds similar to the Partition of India, really, doesn't it? Anyway, I digress. The British government's role supported unionist rule, and its military presence further fueled tensions. Then there was the Bloody Sunday and the Troubles between 1969 and 1998. The late 20th century saw the eruption of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which was a conflict characterized by violence, paramilitary activities, and discrimination. The events of Bloody Sunday in 1972, where British paratroopers killed unarmed civil rights protesters, underscored the oppressive nature of British military intervention. The peace process eventually culminated in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 and sought to address these historical grievances that laid the groundwork for reconciliation. So, in conclusion, people, this has been a lengthy battle between the Irish people and the British Empire, and only recently did it conclude, and it's still under threat today. I mean, the peace process is under threat today because of the geopolitical consequences of Brexit, for example, and the growing tensions with Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, but also the rise of the Republican demand within Northern Ireland to reunite with Republic of Ireland and Britain's general opposition to this unification process. So it's not a conflict that's over, it's still ongoing, and it's number 4 on this list. Number 3, the British opium trade and the Opium War with China. So the British opium trade and the opium wars with China in the 19th century represent a dark chapter in the history of international trade and colonialism. This period is marked by the exploitation of China by the British Empire through the opium trade, which had devastating consequences for the Chinese population and contributed to the deterioration of Sino-British relations. Relations which are still impacted by this in some ways today. So the opium trade can be traced back to the 18th century when British merchants began trading opium grown in India for Chinese tea, silk and porcelain. This trade initially flourished, leading to a significant increase in the importation of opium into China. However, the widespread use of opium in China had severe social, economic and health consequences. Addiction became widespread, leading to a social decay, family disruption and a decline in productivity. The Chinese government, recognizing the detrimental effects of opium, attempted to curb its import and use, which of course did not make the British too happy. Tensions between Britain and China escalated, culminating in the First Opium War between 1839 and 1842. The trigger was the Chinese government's attempt to stop the opium trade, leading to the seizure and destruction of opium stocks, and in response the British government, motivated by economic interests as always and a desire to maintain the opium trade, dispatched military forces to China. The conflict, marked by technological disparities favouring the British, resulted in the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, and the treaty forced China to cede Hong Kong to the British, which remained British until 1997, so 135 years. No, 155 years. Oh my god. And opened 5 ports for trade and pay indemnities. This marked the beginning of the unequal treaties that would further weaken China's sovereignty. And then the Second Opium War came between 1856 and 1860, and this was triggered by conflicts over trade, extraterritoriality, and the murder of a British official, which further humiliated China. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Tientsin and the ratification of the Convention of Peking. These agreements expanded foreign access to Chinese ports, legalized the opium trade, and granted foreigners China's immunity from Chinese law. The opium trade exacerbated Chinese economic woes, contributing to the outflow of silver and undermining traditional Chinese industries. The addiction epidemic and social disintegration added to the country's internal challenges. The Opium Wars marked a significant loss of Chinese sovereignty. Unequal treaties imposed by Western powers granted extraterritorial rights and diminished China's ability to enforce its laws on foreign nationals within its own borders. And, of course, the Opium Wars are often regarded as the beginning of China's century of humiliation, a period characterized by foreign invasions, internal strife, and the erosion of national dignity. The memory of these events continues to shape China's modern nationalism, and today China is, the number 2 economic power in the world, and this is largely because of this. This entire opium trade and opium wars fueled China's desire for change from within, and it led to the revolution, and it led to everything, basically. That's the point here. Please keep up, people. Okay. Then there were the global ramifications. The opium wars had broader global implications, illustrating the ruthlessness of colonial powers in pursuit of economic interests, and the British opium trade exemplified the exploitative practices associated with imperial expansion and the impact of such actions on the society subjected to them. So yes, another dark chapter in the history of the British Empire, one where they went to war with a faraway country over the fact they did not want to buy drugs from the United Kingdom anymore. This was the period when the British Empire was the number 1 drug baron in the world, and for this reason, it's number 3 on this list. Number 2, the Treaty of Waitangi and Britain's repeated violations. So the Treaty of Waitangi is a crucial document in the history of New Zealand. It was signed in 1840 between the British Crown and various Maori chiefs. Its purpose was to establish a legal framework for the coexistence of the indigenous Maori people and the British settlers. However, the subsequent history reveals significant violations of the treaty by the British authorities. The Treaty of Waitangi was intended to create a partnership between the British Crown and Maori chiefs, recognizing the rights of the Maori while also allowing for British settlement. The treaty had both a Maori version and an English version, and there were different wordings in the 2 versions which led to ongoing debates about the precise terms. There were 2 key principles in the treaty. One was the Kawanatanga, which was the governorship. So the British Crown was granted governance, Kawanatanga, over New Zealand. There was the Tino Rangataratanga, the chieftainship, where Maori chiefs retained their authority and ownership over their lands, forests, fisheries, and other possessions. Then, of course, there was the violations of the treaty. So the land confiscation and sales. One of the most significant violations was the large-scale confiscation of Maori land. The interpretation and enforcement of the treaty by the British often led to misunderstandings and disputes. Land was sometimes acquired through dubious means, including unfair sales, coercion, and confiscation. This resulted in the dispossession of many Maoris from their ancestral lands. Then there was the British colonial government undermining Maori cultural practices, including land ownership, language, and the Maori legal system. This cultural suppression contributed to the erosion of Maori social structures and identity. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, legal battles between Maori and the Crown over land rights and treaty violations were common. The New Zealand legal system often favoured the Crown, making it challenging for Maori to secure justice. The impact of the treaty violations is evident in the social and economic disparities between Maori and non-Maori populations in New Zealand. These disparities persist today and are the focus of ongoing efforts to address historical injustices. The effects of this are still felt to this day. Are we surprised? The British Empire, people. Then there is the modern reckoning of reconciliation. So the Waitangi Tribunal, in response to Maori grievances, Waitangi Tribunal was established in 1975 to investigate breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi. The tribunal has played a crucial role in acknowledging historical injustices and recommending remedies to them. Then the New Zealand government has engaged in negotiations and settlements with Maori tribes to address historical injustices and breaches of the treaty. Apologies have been offered for specific wrongs against Maori people. And then the Treaty of Waitangi remains a living document with contemporary significance. Efforts to honour its principles and address historical injustices are still ongoing, reflecting a commitment to building a more equitable and inclusive society in New Zealand. So again, as we can see, the British Empire interfered in New Zealand, miles away, might as well be a million miles away from the United Kingdom, from Britain, the island of Britain. I have a video on the differences and I just made the mistake. Whoopsie daisy. They interfered here and they created problems. They eroded the language. They eroded the culture. We see it time and time again. There are many countries, my own Wales being included, which have faced these consequences of British invasion, and yeah, depressing, isn't it? Anyway, we have finally made it to number 1. And again, these are in no particular order, but this one is probably up there with the worst because I think all of these are in some ways equally bad. So number 1 is slavery. Yes, I know Britain didn't invent slavery. It had been around with the ancient Egyptians, with ancient Rome.
I'm afraid that in many ways the Romans were bastards.
Ancient Greece, it has been around for thousands of years. So this is more of a focus on the transatlantic slave trade spanning from the 16th to 19th centuries rather than the entire history of slavery, okay? So Britain played a significant role in this trade, both as a major slave trading nation and as a colonial power that benefited from the labor of enslaved individuals. So let's take a look. British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade began in the late 16th century when English merchants started engaging in the business of human trafficking. Portuguese had already initiated the trade, but the British became major participants as the demand for labor in the American colonies especially increased. The transatlantic slave trade operated within a triangular network. British ships would sail to West Africa, where they would trade goods for enslaved Africans. The captives were then transported across the Atlantic, often in horrendous conditions, as can be imagined, to the Americas. In the Americas, these individuals were sold into slavery and the ships returned to Britain, completing the triangle. So first, let's take a look at economic impact and profit motive. So the transatlantic slave trade contributed significantly to the economic prosperity of Britain during the 17th and 18th centuries. You want to know why Britain became extremely powerful during these times? Well, the slave trade probably is one of the main reasons. Enslaved labor played a crucial role in the production of lucrative commodities such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, driving economic growth and financing industrialization. British colonies in the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica and Barbados, became major centers of sugar production, heavily reliant on enslaved labor. The profits generated from these plantations enriched British merchants and fueled the expansion of the British Empire. Then was the emergence of the abolitionist sentiment. So over time, Enlightenment ideas, especially in the sort of early to mid 1700s, and this changed moral sentiments and contributed to the rise of abolitionist movements within Britain, France, Europe, and the wider world. Individuals like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson particularly played key roles in advocating for the abolition of transatlantic slave trade. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, making the transatlantic slave trade illegal. This marked a significant step towards the eventual abolition of slavery in the British Empire. While the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was a pivotal moment, it did not immediately end slavery. Enslaved individuals continued to endure forced labor until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 officially abolished slavery in most of the British Empire. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to shape social, economic, and racial dynamics globally. Many argue that the economic gains from slavery contributed to the disparities between nations and have had long-lasting impacts on the descendants of those who were enslaved. There are entire studies into this, many books available on the topic, and it's recommended reading, people. In recent years, there have been increasing calls for reparations from descendants of enslaved individuals. The idea is rooted in the belief that the economic and social consequences of slavery have endured for generations, and addressing these historical injustices is a necessary step towards building a more equitable future. So, in short, descendants of slaves are far more likely to be from poorer backgrounds even today than those who are descendants of the slave owners, who typically are occupying most of Hollywood. There, I said it, okay? Many people in Hollywood are descendants of slave owners. I said it, okay? Politicians too, okay? It doesn't end there. So, in conclusion, Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade was significant and had profound consequences for the enslaved individuals and their descendants. While the eventual abolition of the slave trade and slavery itself represented progress, the legacies of this dark chapter in history continue to influence contemporary discussions on justice, reparations, and the ongoing struggle against systemic racism. So acknowledging this history especially is essential for fostering a more inclusive and equitable society, and it's vitally important that we never allow this practice to happen again. And sadly it does. It's not necessarily called slavery anymore, but forced labor exists in many countries to this day. And just because they've changed the name of slavery to forced labor or workshops or sweatshops or whatever, it doesn't mean slavery has ended. It is when the poorer people have to work for a rich employer for very little money. This is still wage slavery. But that's a whole other topic for a whole other time. So there you have it. Those are the 10 crimes, 10 of the worst crimes of the British Empire. Now, yes, there are many more which we could have included. We could have included Britain's role in Iran, the Iranian famine of the 1940s. We could have included Britain's role in the formation of Saudi Arabia. We could have included the Iraq and Afghanistan wars of recent times. I didn't include these because they are technically after the British Empire, but technically you could include them too. Anyway, if you want more content like this, please hit the subscribe button, and a like would be good too, if you don't mind. And then you can follow us on facebook.com/The Collective Histories page, and Instagram at instagram.com/The Collective Histories, and we're on X or Twitter at twitter.com/Collective Histo. All your support means so much to us, and we hope to continue making this kind of content. We're making 3 large videos a week, and every single day, without fail, we make an On This Day in History short. So if you can watch watch these videos and support us, we would truly appreciate your help. As we have seen a growing number of comments in recent times commending the quality of the videos on this page, on this YouTube channel, we hope to continue impressing you and building up a community over time. We only have 52 subscribers as of this recording, but we are planning or hoping to build a much stronger base where we can provide you all with informative historical content through my ramblings. Anyway, have a lovely day, and we'll continue with another long video on Monday. So as said, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that's our long video schedule. And then every day, every morning, typically, we have a short video for On This Day in History. So that's our schedule going forward, and it's what it will always be unless something drastic changes. Anyway, have a lovely day and see you soon. Okay, goodbye.